evening, everyone. We are both thrilled and honoured and privileged, actually, this evening to be in conversation with the author of Apeirogon, Colum McCann. The book is shortlisted here in the United Kingdom for the Wingate Prize, and the winner will be announced first week in March. So a brief bio. Colum was born in Dublin and now lives in New York. He is a distinguished professor of creative writing in the Master of Fine Arts program at Hunter College in New York. He is the author of 7 novels and has won numerous awards. Last week, Debbie and I discussed Apeirogon, and I subsequently assured Debbie that I would use my best endeavours to secure an interview with Colum. So thanks again, Colum, for fulfilling Debbie's dream. So without further ado, please tell us how you came to write this wonderful book, Apeirogon.
Well, thank you so much, and it's such an honor to talk to you, and it's such an honor to be nominated for the Wingate Prize as an Irish author, living in the States, who spent a lot of time now in the Middle East. I stumbled upon this story when I traveled, and I was in Jerusalem, in a little town called Beit Jala, and I met 2 men, Rami Elhanan and Bassam Armin, one Israeli, one Palestinian, who sat down and told me the stories of their daughters and how they'd lost their daughters to the conflict, but how in a sort of Scheherazade moment, they bring back the memory of their daughters by telling the story. And also they foster an idea of peace through the act and the art of storytelling. They're remarkable men, and they've become the best of friends. And history says they shouldn't be friends, but they are.
Yeah, and interesting you mentioned Scheherazade, because the 1001 Nights feature in the book a lot, don't they?
That's correct. Yeah, I mean, this was the big moment for me when I was writing the book, and I wasn't. Sometimes an author is not as clever as they appear when a book is published. Sometimes you're just searching and searching and searching, and I was excavating this whole idea and writing the stories of Rami and Bassam. And when I realized that they were telling the stories in order to keep their daughters alive, it was like, aha, 1001 Nights. And I was already fracturing the book in numerous small chapters. And I decided to do it in 1001 cantos to sort of pay homage to that. And also to try to write a book that in certain ways imitates the consciousness of the internet. When we jump from one thing to the next, but always coming back to the core reality, the core beauty of the story of these 2 men who, against all evidence, travel the world and are become proponents for decency, belonging, and the need that we need to know one another.
Yeah. What I'm interested to know is the significance in the migration of the birds to the theme of the story.
Oh, thank you for that. Yes, a lot of the book concentrates on birds. And when I was in Jerusalem and in Beit Jala, I found that there were 2 bird ringing centers. Right. The birds were beautiful too. They were just beautiful. I mean, the idea of it's the second busiest super highway for migratory birds in the world, and just the idea of these flocks of birds passing over this narrow strip of land where all these human stories are unfolding underneath. It just seemed to me to be a gorgeous image.
Right. Yeah. And the next question, I'd like if you could tell us a little bit more about the numbering of the chapters and the significance of the way you number the chapters.
Yes. Now I'm not much of a mathematician, but there's a little bit of math in the book. It's 1001 chapters, as we said, and it goes from 1 to 500, and then 500 down to 1. In certain ways, the book can be read backwards and forwards. It's a little challenging to do so, but you can read it going backwards. And it just seemed to me that this story that would sit in the middle, which is 1001, the Canto 1001, where it says, we are a song of songs, we're all there, we all go to Israel and Palestine. We're all silent, we're all complicit, we're all heartbroken, and all of these things, but we're also given the prospect of joy. That also sits in the center of the book. And then, of course, numbers are important, the number 18 being very important in Jewish culture, for instance. And then I also have amicable numbers in there too, which is a complicated mathematical theory, but just think of them as numbers that are friendly to one another, surprising numbers that are friendly to one another, which is kind of what Rami and Bassam happen to be.
Right, right.
Yeah, I'm telling you, at certain places, the book did move me to tears. And at other places, I was traveling along with certainly Bassam when he went through the checkpoints. And I was just as impatient as he was going through the checkpoints. And I felt very much with him. And there were times when he took a cigarette out and I thought, I can understand why you're taking a cigarette out. And I was happy, and when I went through one of the checkpoints, when the Russian soldier had the decency to explain to him why she stopped him and tied him up, etc. Because, well, actually, I won't spoil it for people, but I thought that was nice because she had the decency to explain to him, and it showed that she had a human side to it, despite doing what sometimes is an inhuman job. There was one review I read which said, you can't read this book standing up. And I thought, absolutely, because I read it on a couch. And if you didn't have the comfort of a couch to sit and absorb what you were taking in, then your knees would surely buckle beneath you.
Wow. Thank you so much for saying that. I have to say that when I went to Israel and Palestine, it was hard sometimes to stand up. It was hard sometimes to see what was going on and what was being said. But those beautiful moments, when people defied expectations, little human moments that we're entirely capable of. Those are the magical things that if we can grasp them and say that they exist and have them exist more and more and more. And I think we can do that through stories and storytelling. The fact of the matter is that, Bassam has seen some terrible things. Rami has seen some terrible things, but they continue to keep going because they know that they can get at people's hearts. And when you get at people's hearts rather than their heads, something profound can happen. And I do believe in the possibility eventually of a sort of emergent peace, sort of, Debbie, like a flock of birds coming out from underneath and emerging into a sort of deep knowledge of one another. It takes bravery. You have to risk things. You risk sentimentality. You risk being humiliated. You risk all sorts of things. But in the end, I think it's very, very much worth it. And I love those people the peacemakers are the ones who take risks.
Right. What was so meaningful for me, I was brought up in South Africa during the apartheid system. And when it was abolished, we had the Truth and Reconciliation. And I remember we were all glued to the TV set, listening to the stories. And this book reminded me so much of that it took one man like Nelson Mandela that had pure, motives, and he changed from a very fractured society and he achieved peace. And we have these two fathers. I mean, the one wife is an activist but it's the simple father, the husband that is changing history. And if you think of the period now with COVID, who are the true heroes? It's the nurses and the doctors. So that's why I think your story gave me so much hope.
one of the things, Debbie, about the ordinary people, the so-called ordinary people, is that they can do the extraordinary, and the possible happens within the impossible. So that it is people like Nelson Mandela, it is people like Rami and Bassam, it is people like Martin Luther King who can come along and put a chink of light in the wall of darkness, and you never know when it is that that wall is going to fall, whether that be the Berlin Wall, whether it be what happened in Northern Ireland, whether it be what happened in South Africa. We have to sort of dare to believe that our individual actions can have an effect, just like Greta Thunberg walking out of class and in her classroom one Friday afternoon. A year later, it becomes a global movement. These things are eminently possible, and so we have to keep doing them even when they fail. And in fact, in certain ways, failure is vivifying, because Rami and Bassam, they go on, they tell their story over and over and over again. That might be disconcerting to others, but they know that eventually you will hear it, or I will hear it, or people in London will hear it, and a new consciousness comes about, and we start to talk about it, and things start to change. And that's what's beautiful about what you're saying. That peace can come in very surprising and dramatic ways.
Right.
Yeah.
I just interesting. While I was reading the book, just sort of with a few chapters in, I did think to myself, we could do with a map. But then I thought, actually, the story here is really universal, and it's typical of many conflicts, so one doesn't need a map.
Thank you for saying that. I mean, I did think about a map, and then I thought, no, this is a map of the human heart. This is a map of everywhere. This book, these men belong in Kentucky and the Bronx, or London and Belfast, or Stockholm, where as much as they do in Jericho and Jerusalem. They tell a universal story. And one of the things that the book does is sort of, in the beginning, it's kind of a little confusing. There's all these things that are happening. And what I wanted the reader to do was to sort of embrace his or her confusion, saying it's okay to be confused. Because guess what? I'm still confused about what happened in Northern Ireland, and I grew up in Dublin. And when we acknowledge our confusion, I think we acknowledge some of our deep humanity, and the messiness of human experience allows us to go in and reinvigorate ourselves, so that it's okay for us to say, oh, I don't understand exactly what's going on here, but what we do understand is the pain of a father. What we do understand is the loss of a child. What we do understand are those terrible and gorgeous human moments that we all experience all around the world. And so in that respect, I wanted Apeirogon to be a universal book, yes.
How did you set upon the name?
Oh, my publishers were very brave to allow me to continue to do it. I was looking for a shape with many sides, and because this is not about two sides. We all know that there are so much more than two sides. Two sides is a disease of simplicity. But when I started researching, I found this word Apeirogon, which means a shape with a countably infinite number of sides, which boggled my mind for a while. I mean, I was bamboozled by this. But then I understood that this story is infinite, but we can land on a finite point within the infinite story at any time. And we're all there. We all belong to Abir. We all belong to Smadar. We all belong to Bassam. We all belong to a title that would stand out, and it's hopefully unforgettable. But it is an unusual title at first.
How was your book received in Israel and within the Arab societies?
It's been very interesting to see how it's been received. On one hand, it's been a book that I've gotten more letters from, from the Arab world and the Jewish world or the Israeli world than any other book I've ever written, all put together. And some people were angered by the book, but most people have embraced it in an extraordinary way. There's an Arabic translation. We're working to get a Hebrew translation. And, some people thought, oh, what right does he have to go in and write about that part of the world? And I understand that notion, he's Irish. He lives in America. Why is he writing about that part of the world? Well, the reason I think that I have access to it is because I actually had no particular skin in the game. Right. I wasn't coming at it from any particular political perspective. Right. I came at it from a human perspective, and I recognized, what was beautiful about Rami and Bassam, and I didn't carry the weight of too much history behind me, too much engagement behind me, and and in a way, it's a form of cultural celebration as well. I want to know about that part of the world. It's important for all of us, and it's still an Irish novel for me, believe it or not, because I'm from Ireland. But in other ways, it's just a global novel as well.
Well, you certainly had an interesting insight into how, well, there were two alternatives, how the soldier would grow up after the cases had all finished, etc., etc. You saw it was two complete versions of a typical Israeli.
Right. It was really fascinating. I spent a lot of time in Israel and in Palestine. I walked through the streets. I walked through the checkpoints. I traveled on Rami's motorbike. I went in the car with them, Bassam. I dined with their families. I walked in the hills. I met writers, Asaf Gavran, who lives in Israel, and Raja Shahade, who lives in Ramallah. And I tried to soak it all up, and I tried to understand, what it might mean to be, a person who lives there with lots of different avenues for the life to be. And I wanted it to be authentic. So one of the things I did was I gave it to a lot of writers. I gave it to a lot of Israeli writers. I gave it to a lot of Palestinian writers to go over it and to check it for mistakes or perceived mistakes. Because sometimes people would say, well, that's right. And another person would say, well, that's wrong. And the truth comes in then in between, and that's one of the places where I try to dwell the most. I dwell in between the apparent truths and try to make it as honest as possible.
And what you referred earlier when you were talking about the little bits and pieces that people have to put together to understand, there was one piece that I puzzled over. When Rami went to war in 1973, he was ill-equipped. And I think to most Israelis, that was a metaphor for the 1973 war. And the irony was that he had to rely on a weapon that he'd taken from the other side to ensure his own survival. I think that I saw that as a metaphor. And the part I did laugh when you referred to Senator Mitchell as old iron pants. But it emphasized the fact, that listening is what it's all about, hearing the other side.
Exactly. It's all about listening. So when I sat with Rami and I listened to his story about 1973, and you're entirely right, what an incredible irony it was that everybody was under-equipped, and he goes out to the front. He ends up carrying a Kalashnikov, when you hear those stories and you try to make them real, and it is about a deep form of listening, which is what Rami and Bassam give to one another. They both listen to one another, but they also listen to several other people. Like, I would love for them to come to you at some stage and maybe, you know, in person when COVID is gone, maybe I can come over myself and we can all have a talk. I would love that, because listening is the key. Listening is the absolute key. It's not even so much about telling the story. It's about being able to hear the story and to tell it back. So I'm involved with a group called Narrative 4, which brings young people from all over the world together to tell one another stories. So you tell my story, I tell yours. And what that does, it engenders a sort of radical empathy, where you make the leap into somebody else's life, so that a young girl in, say, London can tell the story of, you know, a young boy in Glasgow. Can you imagine? You know, and they step into one of the shoes. Yeah. And in doing that sort of thing, we learn how to listen and tell.
Well, we've certainly stepped into Rami and Bassan's shoes. By virtue of a wonderful book, and I'm sure Debbie will join me in inviting you, please God, when this COVID finishes, to our community when we can discuss, listen, exchange, etc., etc. And it just remains me just to thank you so much for sparing the time. We've gone well over time, but we've enjoyed every minute of it. And it's been a wonderful experience. And Debbie would probably want to add her own footnote.
Well, I must say, when I finished the book, it was the first book that I wanted to reread because there's so much behind every word. And I loved that it was a positive, hopeful message. It's the first time that you think, well, maybe something is going to change in the Middle East. And I look forward to the day when the Israelis don't have to join the army and they can live in peace among each other.
Look, it has to happen. As Rami says, peace is an inevitability. It's just when it happens and how we make it happen and how we can shape our societies towards it happening. It will happen eventually, and the sooner the better, right?
Let's hope so. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much. It was
thank you so much.
Thank you.
We'll see you in London.
Bye.
Please God, yeah, I've got all your details and I know where you live.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thanks.
Thanks.